Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Jenny Sinclair. I'm founder and director of Together for the Common Good, and I'm speaking to you from the London Jesuit Centre, where we have a live invited audience. A very warm welcome to you watching at home, and a welcome to this special evening, Grace, Truth and the Common Good, the Future of Christian Social Action. So I felt for some time that we need an honest conversation about the relationship between churches, charities, and communities trapped in poverty. And to start that conversation, I've invited Jon Kuhrt to speak tonight. I know his talk will be challenging and inspiring in equal measure. My hope is that this will prompt some deep reflection about the causes of poverty and how we as Christians respond. So this event is being held in memory of the late Frank Field. Frank was an outstanding parliamentarian and social reformer, unequalled in his dedication to improving the lives of people trapped in poverty. A committed Anglican Christian, his work ranged from groundbreaking child poverty action group to lobbying for jobs in Birkenhead, from legislation for the minimum wage to co-founding Feeding Britain. Frank was devoted to the people of Birkenhead, where he was their MP for 40 years. Frank thought deeply about putting Christian theology into practice in a way that balanced grace and truth. And it was this that connected Jon with Frank. But let me just share a few thoughts about Frank. We have to recognize that over the last 40 years, times have really changed. The need for abolishing modern slavery, along with building food banks, was something that Frank said he couldn't conceive of being needed when he began his career. This should show us that as times change, our responses need to change too. Now, Frank rejected the orthodoxy of the left and indeed the right in favour of something far more principled, which for many means something a lot more awkward. He was a person who would not give up. When faced with his constituents' challenges, he would ask smart, compassionate, probing questions. He achieved no fewer than 14 major reforms, all of which have changed people's lives for the better. And everything he did was based on rigorous research and from the deep listening he did to people trapped in poverty. He had an unrivaled ability to garner cross-party support. Finding support from across the political divide remains one of the bravest things any politician can do. He had supernatural skills of persuasion. He was known for his incessant cheerfulness. He set up many organizations, and people would ask him, how do you manage to achieve so much? His answer was surprising and moving. He said that with no marriage and no children, he had love to spare. He loved his people. In fact, he consistently refused offers of an easier life. He would not abandon Birkenhead. He believed that we can all make a difference and that we have a duty to. Frank was a good friend of my mother's, and he and I became friends too. And he always encouraged the work of Together for the Common Good. How blessed are we to have known him? So in a moment, I will introduce Jon. But first, I'd just like to thank CCLA for sponsoring this event. CCLA is our longtime partner and a great friend to Together for the Common Good for nearly 10 years now. CCLA is the UK's leading sustainability fund manager for charities, faith and public sector organisations with a long history of managing assets for Christian organisations. They have an investment fund aligned with Catholic social teaching, and they run the Better World Fund for individual investors. And they provide the secretariat for the Church Investors Group, helping Christian investors generate faith-aligned investment policies. So in a moment, Jon will speak for about 45 minutes. And after that, we will have a fairly short Q&A, some from those in the room here and some from you watching online. So if you have questions to put to Jon, would you please put them in the chat? So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jon. Jon Kuhrt is Chief Executive of Hope into Action and host of the Grace and Truth blog. Formerly, Jon was the rough sleeping advisor to the DLUHC and the CEO of West London Mission and Director of Community Mission for Livability. Jon thinks deeply about putting Christian theology into practice in a way that balanced grace and truth. And it was this that connected him with Frank Field. Jon, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. It's a real honour to be asked to give this lecture. So I'm very grateful to Together for the Common Good, and especially Jenny for your sort of belief in me and what I've got to share tonight. And it's a particular privilege to speak in memory of Frank Field. As Jenny said, Frank's lifelong commitment to improving the lives of people trapped in poverty was a real inspiration to me. I just thought his voice was so distinctive and different, not just set within the usual confines of political orthodoxy. And I know that so many of you in the room and those online share deep concerns about the deteriorating state of conditions for people affected by poverty here in the UK. And Frank was willing to be really honest about the complexities and realities of poverty, brave enough to say the hard things. And I look around the room and I know many of you are sort of neck deep in these challenges, and we need more than superficial sound bites at this time. As Jenny said, Frank was a man of deep Christian conviction. The title of his memoir, Politics, Poverty and Belief, really sums up his vocation. And I only met Frank once, properly. I heard him speak a few times. I only really heard him once. We were both proud graduates of Hull University. Do you have any other Hull graduates? No, what a shame. You missed out. And our former Vice-Chancellor, David Dilks, brought us together, invited us both for a lunch in a very posh club in Pall Mall. Frank had kindly read a booklet that I had written called Grace, Truth and Transformation. I'd co-written it with a friend of mine called Chris Ward, and Chris had been a rough sleeper for 3 years. He'd been resettled into a house after being homeless, and he was getting some help from a local church. But Chris was being very demanding and very aggressive. And the trigger moment really for his change, for his recovery journey, was when an old lady in his church really sharply challenged him about his behaviour. As Chris said, everyone else in the church was nice, but it was her truth that really made the difference. And the booklet that me and Chris wrote together bound his journey with some of my theological and practical reflections. And that lunch in Pall Mall, if I'm honest, I was a little bit in awe of Frank, but he was so generous and encouraging to me. My thinking, as Jenny said, about grace and truth really chimed with some of his concepts, especially this idea of self-interested altruism that Frank wrote. As he wrote in his memoir, there's a great importance for balancing one great idea against another in order to avoid an unbalanced and even extreme argument. Our fallen natures have to be seen alongside the possibilities of our redemption. And Frank was concerned that the reality of sinful human nature meant that welfare systems, to be effective, cannot just be based on altruism alone. That's naive. We have to go with the grain of human nature as it really is. Humans need grace more than anything, but we also need truth. And these are the kind of themes that we're going to be exploring tonight. I'm going to start with a bit of a story about how grace and truth connect to my work, and then talk about some of the key challenges for Christian social action as I see them. Then I'll unpack a practical theology of grace and truth that I believe addresses those challenges. And I'll end by proposing 5 directions for the future. I'm going to be drawing from the evangelical tradition that I grew up in, as well as this body of thinking called Catholic social teaching. And I'll be particularly referencing Lesslie Newbigin and a little bit of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So in terms of grace and truth and how they affect me in the work that I've done, I just go back to 2015. I was asked to speak at a Church Urban Fund conference in the northeast of England. It was called Homelessness, Are We Really Helping? There was considerable tension in the area about problems relating to rough sleeping and drug use. And there were concerns that Christian and other community groups who were going out onto the streets to give out resources and food were actually making the situation worse. The conference gathered about 120 people from charities, local authority, community groups and churches. And this included no less than 4 bishops, 2 Roman Catholic and 2 Anglican. And I was asked to speak about grace truth. So I used the passage in John 1 about Jesus being full of grace and truth. And I was arguing that these qualities need to be held in balance, reflected in our work, if we want it to be effective. I argued that Christian groups needed to accept a legitimate critique of how they operate, if their approach was kind of all grace, but no truth. If the dynamic was essentially a one-way one, a donor just giving to a passive recipient. I argued that authentic love meant empowering people. It meant both affirmation and kindness, but also challenge and truthfulness. Now, after I spoke, 2 of the bishops made their disapproval pretty clear. One was particularly angry, accused me of taking us back to the days of the deserving and undeserving poor and being judgmental. And it was quite an interesting experience being publicly disagreed by a church leader in a conference like that. Slightly helps, I think. I'm from a family that doesn't mind a bit of robust engagement with bishops. But what reassured me, actually, was that all of the formerly homeless people in the room and those with the frontline experience all agreed with me. A formerly homeless woman explained how all the money that she got through begging always went on drugs, and how proud she was of her progress when she walked into a post office and paid for her electricity bill. That was a sign of her recovery. She said it was the first time in years I hadn't just ripped anyone off. Another formerly homeless woman said this quote, which I think is important: people can't be hand-fed. They need to help themselves. It's all right, these agencies all giving out stuff all the time, but you have to want change for yourself. If you throw everything at people, it's not going to work. And I said to the bishops that I thought these were the stories, these were the voices that we need to hear. And the tension created, and there was a bit of tension, led to a good discussion about naivety and about forms of help that truly empower people to take ownership and responsibility. I'll never forget the head of housing from the local authority came up to me in tears at the end of the event, because she'd expected just to get a hammering at that kind of conference about what she wasn't doing. But she was so grateful to see the genuine complexities being discussed. And that day, at that conference, Grace and Truth provided what you could call a dialectical framework that we grappled with. I think it's a framework that reflects the tension in Catholic social teaching between the principle of solidarity, of standing alongside those affected by poverty, and also subsidiarity, which encourages responsibility to be taken at the appropriate level, focuses on empowering people to help themselves. Pope Benedict said this: subsidiarity is first and foremost a form of assistance to the human person which respects human dignity, by recognizing in that person a subject who is always capable of giving something to others. And using this framework of grace and truth helps us engage with the inevitable tensions that are involved in the complex business of helping others. And I get very distressed that the majority of conferences I go to, both Christian and secular, aren't really engaging with this kind of tension. They remain kind of anodyne events, safe, and frankly quite boring, because there's a fear about disagreement and really grappling honestly with these tensions. I have to say, there was a kind of nice postscript to that event and my encounter with one of the bishops who disagreed with me. About 6 months later, I got a phone call at the West London Mission, which is just based up the road here. And he asked to come and see me. And I was a bit nervous. But basically, he'd done his sabbatical. He'd spent 3 months working at the Catholic charity The Passage in Victoria. And over coffee, he said to me, you know, I had real problems what you said at that conference. But after my experiences on the front line, I'm 85% in agreement with you. I really appreciated his humility and his grace. And I said, I'd accept 85%. And it's a real example of how the front line, the reality of the front line, provides the best crucible to really test our beliefs. We desperately need Christian thinking that integrates more overtly belief and practice. You know, the world of most theological books and conferences are miles away from the frontline staff doing the work. Jesus said, wisdom is proved right by her actions. He didn't say wisdom is proved right by long books. And I believe action and analysis need to be far more integrated, and we need to be far less tolerant when they're not. I like this quote by Ernst Troeltsch. He wrote, "We theorize and construct in the eye of the storm." And what I'm going to share tonight about grace and truth has been developed in the stormy reality of hostels, night shelters where I've worked and volunteered, with people whose lives have been devastated by poverty, trauma and addiction. And I want everything I say to be anchored in real experiences, not floating in some theological or utopian Neverland. So what are the challenges for Christian social action? I mean, the last couple of decades especially, have seen a huge growth in initiatives such as street pastors, debt centres, food banks, pantries, community supermarkets, night shelters, warm hubs. Especially since 2010, the politics and policies of austerity have led to a boom in Christian-led initiatives to tackle poverty. And this expansion might be seen as a good thing, evidence of a growing Christian social conscience. But they provoke important questions. Has our enthusiasm for social action led the church to become just a handmaid of the state, propping up an unjust system, running around filling in the gaps caused by its negligence? Secondly, have these projects really been effective in reducing poverty in sustainable ways? And lastly, have they been an effective way of witnessing to the Christian faith? Or has social action been a cause of secularizing the church? I believe that the growing levels of poverty, homelessness and destitution in the UK, and the fact there's a newly elected Labour government, means that we're at an important crossroads. I believe we need to be really confident about the importance of Christian social action. I don't want to knock it. That's been my whole bag. You know, that's been the people I want to be hanging out with. But we need to be confident, but we also need to be self-critical. Sin plagues all human endeavour, as I'm sure Frank would agree. And our social action efforts are not exempt. So I want to talk about 3 disconnections that I see that are challenges. And firstly, it's the disconnection between charity and justice. The Brazilian Catholic Archbishop said a quote many of you will be familiar with. Dom Helder Camara said, "When I give bread to the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why are the poor hungry, they call me a communist." And then the quote's helpful because it captures that inescapable tension between charity and justice. And as church-based projects have grown in the last 15 years, it's been increasingly common to hear people refer to them in terms of social justice ministry, for example. But social action and social justice are not the same thing. And most Christian activism is based within a charitable framework, people giving their time and their money on a voluntary basis to those in need. And such charitable approaches are often applauded by those with social and economic power because they don't call often for a radical and fundamental change. In fact, power dynamics can be enhanced by charitable work. And I think Jesus spoke about this tension in Luke 22 when he said, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that." We need to ask how the growth of social action connects to the questions of the underlying social and economic systems which create need in the first place. I think our underlying commitment should be to a more just system. And the last 15 years in my field have seen a whole host of new homelessness charities grow up, often emerging from church night shelters. But there are currently more people in temporary accommodation, homeless, than since records began. After a reduction during COVID, rough sleeping's risen by 27% this year. And by last year, 28% the year before. I mean, these kind of numbers just illustrate the fundamental structural injustice of the UK housing market, the broken nature of our housing system. And I believe the church ought to be really careful about becoming the handmaid of the state, as I said, running around filling in the gaps. We mustn't be seduced by the lure of feeling useful and just settling for transactional approaches of welfarism, of projects that provide handouts. This is not social justice. But we can find inspiration in the deep roots of a Judeo-Christian tradition. It's a call for the relational justice of the common good. We need to focus on those aspects of justice that go beyond just increasing welfare benefits. To talk about those things that provide a platform for mutuality and responsibility, fair and affordable housing, decent jobs, proper investment in education and retraining. I think, like Frank, I believe that true social justice enables people to find self-respect, dignity, and purpose. So that's the first disconnection between charity and justice. The second is dependency, the disconnection with empowerment. And the hard truth, as we discussed at that conference in the Northeast, is that not all responses to poverty are helpful or effective in dealing with the problems. A huge amount has been learned over the last few decades about what helps majority world countries overcome poverty. The book Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo argued powerful that aid, often given by richer countries, actually serves to disempower economies and deepen poverty. And we've got to grapple with similar questions domestically. US activist Robert Lupton argues in his book Toxic Charity that often social action deepens problems by deepening dependency and destroying personal initiative. It's a really challenging but recommended book. He writes, when we do for those in need what they have the capacity to do for themselves, we disempower them. And he makes a really helpful distinction between crisis problems and chronic issues. He says we respond generously to stories of people in crisis, but most of our charity goes to people who face predictable, solvable problems of chronic poverty. An emergency response to chronic need is at best counterproductive, and over time is actually harmful. And this is a problem, I believe, in Christian responses to poverty in the UK. The crisis response is easy to fall into, as projects that provide a one-way exchange are straightforward. They're easy to set up, and they're frankly popular with volunteers. But over the years, I've become increasingly nervous and concerned to visit day centres and church drop-ins where there are armies of well-meaning middle-class people running around serving people who are turned into passive recipients. Empowering people is hard, but it's so important. And I've come to believe that running a class to help 10 people to cook for themselves is better than giving free food out to 100 people. The biggest challenge in homelessness is not to give out more resources for free, but how we can help people maintain their accommodation, to pay their rent, to contribute, to use their strength and their skills, to form relationships of real meaning. This is the shift I believe we need to see. And of course, a key problem that Frank put his finger on was that we have dependency and negative incentives baked into our welfare system. Housing benefit particularly disincentivizes people from work, creates the benefit trap, the term that Frank coined, where people are better off not working or end up having to take cash in hand work. Frank's words are so powerful about this. He said, this kind of benefit system is a full frontal attack on working class moral economy that believes in work, effort, saving, and honesty. And when Frank was Minister for Welfare Reform for the Blair government in the late 90s, he proposed this major change from means testing to an insurance-based system. And of course, this would have been incredibly complex and challenging. But I believe this is a kind of tragic sort of sliding doors moment that was missed in our social policy history. I think at that time, the large majority and the economic boom was the moment that this system needed to change. So that's the second one, dependency, and the disconnection from empowerment. And thirdly, secularizing, the disconnection from faith. One of the constant challenges I've worked on in the last 20 years is how Christian groups can maintain an active connection with the church, the faith that birthed them. The homeless sector, of which I've worked in for 30 years, is full of agencies that used to be Christian. And sometimes faith fades due to a lack of passion and confidence. Sometimes it's due to fear about what funders think. And sometimes it just becomes fossilized when a charity's founding inspiration is left to wither and the charism is neglected. So rather than something dynamic and creative, faith can just become a slightly embarrassing footnote in the history of an organization. The fruit becomes disconnected from the roots from which it's grown. And the missionary theologian, Lesslie Newbigin, has been the most significant influence on my thinking. In his autobiography, he writes about an experience where in the 1920s, he goes on a mission as a student to help unemployed Welsh miners. And it was a Christian mission, but it had a strict liberal ethos, and there was nothing religious in the program. And Newbigin writes this, he says, as the weeks went by, I become less and less convinced that we were dealing with the real issues. These men needed some kind of faith that would fortify them for today and tomorrow against apathy and despair. Drafts and ping pong could not provide this. They needed the Christian faith. Now, Newbigin wrote an incredible amount of inspiring books. But this phrase, drafts and ping pong could not provide this, has always stayed with me. In 2013, the secular research agency Lemos and Crane did a survey of homeless people where they discovered how important issues of faith and spirituality were to many of them. They produced a report called Lost and Found that said the secular orthodoxy of the homeless sector more reflected staff perspectives than the perspectives of homeless people themselves. The author was a guy called Carwyn Gravel. He's actually an atheist. So this isn't Christian propaganda. It was independent evidence of the importance of spirituality and faith. And to use Paul Bickley of Theos, his milk metaphor, we don't have to skim out the faith element from our social action. I felt called to work for Hope into Action because of their full fat approach to faith. We make no secret of integrating passionate faith with our professional working practices. Faith is our engine, motivates staff to come and work for us like me, motivates people to to invest their money in houses that we can use for homeless people. It's what motivates the churches we partner with to offer friendship and support. And faith is so relevant to the recovery journey that so many of our tenants are on. Last year, 60 of our tenants wanted to be prayed for. 16 of them decided to get baptized and make a formal commitment to Christ. As one tenant said at her baptism, she said, I'm a recovering alcoholic, 509 days sober today. The Lord did not give up on me. He saw fit to help me rebuild my life. He gave me a safe home to live in, support from Hope into Action, and the generosity of Portsmouth Christian Fellowship. That's the local church. She said, I owe my life to Jesus Christ, and I ask that you all bear witness to my declaration of faith in him. Now, I haven't worked for an organization that shares testimonies like that before, but it shows how relevant faith is to the problems that we're seeking to address. And it doesn't mean we have to not be professional. Just last week, Hope into Action was very pleased to receive an award from the national umbrella body, Homeless Link, for excellence in our work. So I believe these three challenges, the disconnection with justice, the problems of dependency and secularization, are the three key issues facing Christian social action. Our work may have grown, but I believe it needs to mature. And I believe passionately that a practical theology of grace and truth is what we most need in this journey. So I'm going to go on to that now. Doing okay time-wise? Great. Okay. Great. So the grace and truth of Jesus. In John 1:14, it says these famous verses, speaking of the incarnation, Jesus came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The gospel writer uses these two words to sum up Jesus' qualities, grace and truth. And we see these being continually expressed throughout Jesus' teaching and encounters in the gospel narrative. Jesus' grace cannot be recast as simply mild tolerance, uncritical acceptance, or being kind, even with a hashtag. His grace contains a sharp edge of truth about the need for repentance and radical change. No one, he says, can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again. Uncomfortable words like, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. This is seen in many encounters. Take the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus affirms that woman by speaking with her, by asking her to give him a drink. But he speaks challenging truth into her life. This is neither easy acceptance nor harsh judgment. But this is what empowers her to share this life-changing message with her whole community. In the parable of the prodigal son, before the destitute son is received with such grace and forgiveness by the father, he has to come to his senses. He has to face what he has done, repent and return home. His embrace of truth leads to the Father's embrace of grace. And in Jesus, grace and truth are synthesized. They can't be separated. His grace invites us to live in reality, to take responsibility, to embrace the truth about ourselves. I believe the deepest truth is the reality of God's grace, but it's a grace that demands truthfulness. And I would argue that a general weakness of social action is an imbalance of too much grace and not enough truth. Grace without truth becomes what Dietrich Bonhoeffer described as cheap grace, where the church, to quote him, showers blessings with generous hands without asking questions or fixing limits, where the consolations of religion are thrown away at cut prices. But what does this all mean? This theology and clever words, what does it mean for our face-to-face work with people who need help? Well, about 12 years ago, I developed this chart. You've got it, there it is behind me, and you've got it on your postcards there. To set out this grace-truth tension, not in just a long article, but in something just one slide that people can look at and grapple with. The emphasis on grace is shown on the left-hand column, unconditional acceptance, giving another chance, showing compassion, providing support and care, advocating for people's rights, saying yes to people. I put this up at a church homelessness conference a while ago, and I got loads of amens for that side of things. Feel free to do that. People think often that's all that's needed to help others, to show love, to be Christian. But that's not the whole picture. In many ways, the left-hand side is the easy bit. It's not always easy, but in some ways, the harder thing is the right-hand side. As well as acceptance, anyone who's run anything knows that rules need enforcing, as well as giving people chances, boundaries need to be maintained, as well as compassion, justice needs to be implemented. People need challenging and empowering, as well as advocating for their rights. They need to be, encouraged to take their personal responsibility. And the management of this tension has been my daily work for many years. One of the realities that is involved in housing people with complex problems is taking action when people don't pay their rent or when they behave unacceptably. This is something we obviously want to avoid. But actually, it can be a necessary part of someone's journey. I joined Hope into Action partly because when I went to their conference before I worked for them, they had a panel of people talking about how Hope into Action had helped them. And one of them was someone they'd evicted. But he said they were right to evict me. It's what was needed. And we had someone come back to us who we'd evicted a couple of years ago to the office, actually very movingly, to pay off some arrears they owed us. And she said, don't feel bad for 1 second about what you did. It was the right thing to do, and it gave me the kick up the backside I needed. On the front line, this is the kind of complex reality that we work within. This framework behind me has helped me find a kind of hopeful realism that's helped sustain me, helped me avoid burnout, helped me avoid naivety on one hand and cynicism on the other, neither of which help people much. I've learned loads from the 12-step movement. When I was at the West London Mission, just up at Bond Street there, at lunchtime, I'd often go and sit in the open AA meetings that happen in the basement at Hines Street Methodist Church, where we're based. Along with 70 or 80 others, I'd witness some great grace, amazing grace. In the West End of London, you've literally got film stars sitting next to people who are homeless. It's a grace-placed welcome for anyone with an addiction. There's no hierarchy. But this grace is the basis for radical and raw truth-telling. Otherwise, the 12 steps wouldn't work, and they're places of truth. The best places where people can sniff out the kind of bullshit that happens in the addiction world that needs to be turned away from. This is what makes 12 steps so effective. And I found grace and truth so helpful on a more personal level in supporting family members, such as my cousin James, who struggled with a heroin addiction for over 20 years. We spoke regularly, but I maintained really clear boundaries. I said to him, I'm never, ever, ever, ever going to lend you any money. This would lead to the addiction ruining our relationship like it had ruined so much else in his life. And these boundaries, rather than limiting our relationship, they protected and sustained it. And I'm absolutely gutted to say that James died, aged just 45. But I found I could stand at his funeral and speak about his life as one who really knew him, who'd maintained a relationship with him and who loved him. We need more engagement in people's lives, not less. Don't take any of this as a warning to stay away from people. It's the opposite. We need to be healthily honest, though, about the challenges of engaging and staying close to people whose lives are chaotic and demanding. I think wise boundaries are a bit like oven gloves. They enable us to help us handle things that are good and healthy, but offer protection from harm. And I think grace and truth is relevant across the whole spectrum of social action: debt prevention, food distribution, youth work, supporting those with mental health challenges, counselling, and just about all pastoral work. Our world is dying for authentic love. And the reason grace and truth are a strong foundation for social action is because they are the key components of love. God revealed his love to a Jesus Christ who was full of grace and truth. The best thing we can do is reflect that to the world around us. So I'm coming into my conclusion now, and I'm going to end with these 5 points, 5 directions for the future of Christian social action. In his book, Subversive Spirituality, Eugene Peterson wrote these sobering words. This is an urgent time, and the task of the Christian is to learn how to maintain that urgency without getting panicked, to stay on our toes without caving into culture. This is not a benign culture where everything is going to be fine. Everything is not going to be fine. And obviously he's writing from the US, and I think he's right to be issuing that warning. Great challenges face us. But I do believe, as I've said, that the grace and truth of the crucified and risen Jesus Christ offers the deepest hope and the surest foundation. Three of my directions relate to my 3 points earlier, and I've added 2 extra. So firstly, it's that Christian social action must be accompanied by a Christian model of justice. As Pope Francis has said, the church is not an NGO. We must resist being flattered for our usefulness or instrumentalized as a service provider. We must recognize the distinctive and prophetic voice the church needs to have. We stand at a crisis point in terms of homelessness in this country and poverty. We cannot be content to just prop up an unjust system underpinned by a neoliberal philosophy that favours big corporations, that makes low wages, welfare dependency and food banks a permanent feature of our social architecture. To reduce the need for these services, we need to go beyond increasing welfare benefits. The causes are deeper than what handouts can fix. We need reforms and investment that generate meaningful work, that enable people to have self-respect. Is the church courageous enough to challenge the new administration to reform an economic model that generates incomes that are simply too low to live on? We should seek a positive yet distinctive relationship with the government, clear about what we agree on, affirming those things that we agree on, but willing to challenge the underlying systemic problems. We need to avoid the sort of justice nostalgia of looking back 40 years to reports like Faith in the City. Instead, we need to consider what is needed now. This is a new time for a new conversation. Secondly, our social action, I think, must be empowering and build mutuality. We need to look at ourselves as well and our own practices. Poverty is more than just a lack of resources. It's about relationships and identity. As Pope Francis puts it, caring for the poor is more than simply a matter of hasty handouts. It calls for re-establishing the just interpersonal relationship that poverty harms. So alongside looking at the government, we need to look at our own emphasis. A shift towards helping people into work which generates enterprises, uses skills, and empowers strengths. I think this means transitioning from food banks to initiatives such as pantries, community groceries, where people become members and pay for discounted food with dignity. The kind of work that Frank championed. It means helping people into social enterprises to work. People are not helped, I don't believe, by being passive recipients. Relationships are at the heart of what it means to be human. Relationships to be healthy need to be two-way and mutual. Transformation happens through reciprocity, where people are able to give and receive. Hope into Action's frontline staff are called empowerment workers. And recently, one of our tenants who'd suffered terrible domestic violence said this to me: "My empowerment worker didn't just give me a ladder to help me get out of the situation. She showed me how to build my own staircase." What can we be doing to help people build their own staircases and not just to rely on our ladders? Number 3, social action should deepen its Christian distinctiveness. Lesslie Newbigin said, "The business of the church is to tell and embody a story." And I believe social action can help tell that story in a compelling way. But we have to hold our nerve and integrate faith and deepen our Christian distinctiveness. In his memoir, Frank wrote about his low-key approach he took to expressing his faith because he was concerned about it affecting the campaigning he was doing. And many of us, if we're honest, probably prefer an implicit form of faith expressed through what we do. But this is a new time. I believe the times call for a social action agency to be more explicit, to be bolder and more confident. We need to show in a time of spiritual confusion that faith is not a private matter. As Newbigin continually argued, the gospel is public truth. We do not proclaim a privatized belief. But the community that confesses Jesus is Lord has been from the beginning a movement launched into the public life of mankind. And of course, we need to guard against theological arrogance. But I don't see that as the danger in social action. I think the biggest danger is that we're too anxious and we're too timid. We need what Newbigin termed proper confidence, so that we can tell the story about why we do what we do. The challenge is personal for each one of us. As Jim Wallace always says, faith is personal, but never private. Do we truly believe that God is at work in the lives of those we serve? That knowing his saving love can be consistent with the other positive outcomes we want to see for people affected by poverty? Here I want to show a picture. I think it's going to come up behind me. of a recent baptism of one of Hope into Action's tenants at Oakham Baptist Church. Now, I know full immersion baptism may seem alien to many here. It might cause some instinctive reactions in you, which are interesting to note. But sit with this image and consider carefully what you see. I think it speaks 1,000 words. Our tenant is there tattooed and covering his face. Someone who's been through so much. Someone who's overcome with emotion through accepting the deepest offer the church has. A new identity in Christ. And what I love, this isn't a private ceremony, it's within the context of a community, multi-ages, clapping, welcoming him into their family. Might be an inappropriate analogy, but I think this is the Heineken effect of the church. Apologies to the Methodists. Reaching the parts that the voluntary sector never can. Let's not cut ourselves off from these kind of opportunities. That's number 3. Number 4 is I believe we need to be beware of superficiality and pay attention more to messy realities. The language of social justice is increasingly popular in Christian circles. I remember being told that when you talk about faith, you should always mention the J word, talk about Jesus. I said this to someone at a conference. Someone overheard me saying the J word, and they came and joined us and said, absolutely, justice is so important. And justice is increasingly popular in Christian circles. But in a church culture affected by capitalism, social justice, I see, increasingly also in danger of becoming a commodity, a brand to be sold, to wear and parade on social media. I'm increasingly nervous about people I see talking very fluently, whose words aren't really weighed down by the messy business of actually doing the work. This superficiality feeds polarization. It turns some of these social media discussions into simple, unhelpful discussions about goodies and baddies. But real life simply isn't like that. I think Bonhoeffer's statement that the person who loves their dream of community will destroy community is relevant. Could be recast as those who love their dreams of social justice end up undermining social justice. Rather than utopian dreams or ideological theologies, we need to anchor our concept of justice in real life, in the broken, sinful reality of the world's systems and people, and our messy and partial attempts to make the world better. And number 5, I think we need to build a new movement of Christian social action networks. Christian social action charities often working in silos, shaped by their church tradition or their denominations. They don't know each other well enough, and often they're not coordinated. And I don't believe the UK's ever really had a properly ecumenical social action network, bringing together the wide enough agencies, often actually that are represented in this room. The closest thing, I think, was FaithWorks, which gathered thousands to their annual conferences in the early 2000s. And I think, again, we need to rouse a genuine movement of people motivated by their faith, working for the common good. We need to listen to what God is doing within the church now. And most importantly, what he's doing in communities and neighborhoods trapped in poverty. This was the approach that Frank took, listening to God, listening to the people of Birkenhead, responding with compassion, but also courage and honesty. And this is why Frank's death caused such a huge outpouring of appreciation, because of that listening and that commitment. So just as I wrap up, I want to thank you for listening to me, those in the room, those online. Thanks again, Jenny, for the invite. I do believe this is a critical time across the West, a key time for our nation. Christian witness in word and deed is needed more than ever. But our social action needs to grapple with the hard questions about injustice, dependency, and secularization. We need, who are we going to listen to, and how will we organize in a way that integrates our concern for justice, empowerment, and faith? These words of Jeremiah speak for the need for discernment. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it. Let's be confident that this ancient path, this good way to walk, can be found in the grace and truth of Jesus Christ. As John puts it in John 1, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Jon. That was amazing. We already have some questions online, and I'd like to open up to the floor as well. If there's anyone has a burning question they would like to ask, can I ask you to come and stand here? You'll be on camera, so it might be not helpful for some who are shy, but perhaps there's two or three that would have a question they'd like to ask Jon. Come and stand here. I'm going to start with this question from online. It is at these shelters, food banks, pantries, etc., that people congregate. My experience of a number of years in these places of provision is that most people want to escape dependency. As a counsellor, I'm overwhelmed at each food bank hub session by people wanting advice and support to exit their circumstances. Wraparound advice seems to be a key need, and meeting people where they are is vital. We can bring both the hubs, whatever they look like, and the support to flourish together. Are these two strands mutually exclusive?
No, I don't think they are. And I think in homelessness, it's been a good crucible of grappling with these things. A lot of homeless day centres, for example, opened up, just open access when they first opened. Come in, receive loads of stuff. But virtually all of them take a journey towards intentionality. Actually limiting the time when you just come in for food. I mean, that's almost a loss leader, to use kind of commercial terminology, in order to get people in so that you can deal with the actual issues, kind of work Angie does here, which is so relevant. Then you want to focus the work as much as possible. So it's not just open access food. That can be important, but people need focused work. They need one-to-one work with experts. They need to sit down to do forms, boring things like that, to overcome benefit problems and to apply for housing, to escape dependency. So they are mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. They can work together. They need to work together because there is crisis problems. But we've got to work in such a way that is aware of the impact of what we do. Now, homelessness has such a danger of creating dependency that I think it's ahead of the curve on some of these things. And that's the journey that a lot of thoughtful charities are going down. And it's just like that chart. The reason I put treated as a guest and treated as a client is because both are important. One of the reasons, Jacob's here from Housing Justice, and Housing Justice coordinate all these night shelters that offer a lovely welcome to people, beautiful welcome of a guest. Come in, sit down, have a hot meal. You don't get a welcome like that in any hostel that you pay to live in. They're the opposite often. But that alone isn't enough. They need to do client work. They need to do the tough stuff of getting the forms, overcoming the barriers, and they need both.
Thank you, Jon. Can we have our first question?
Sure. Hello, Jon.
Hello.
Claire Fenner.
You've got a marker there. There we go. Yeah, well done.
And I just have totally missed the mark, but hopefully not with this question. Claire Fenner-Crawley from the Good Faith Partnership. Thank you so much for that. So much of that was so spot on. And I think some of what you said about us needing to reduce dependency culture, embrace mutuality, and tell the truth. I think we all know we need to do that, but it's really hard. And I'm wondering whether we need to build the character to do those really hard things. I'm wondering if you think that's a correct diagnosis, that it's actually a bit of a character issue in some of us, leaders, volunteers, the Christians doing the social action. And if so, do you have any suggestions for how we could try to build some of that character?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it is like a muscle. We need to build it up. We need to get better at it. The more we can feel confident that we've got people's best intentions at heart. I mean, that's for me, the biggest thing is, am I loving that person? And those of us who are parents know that chart is very relevant to parenting. Those tensions, you're not showing love just by doing the easy things. It's speaking truth. I mean, I've been most helped by people who I've become into friendships with. I mean, Chris Ward, who I wrote the booklet with, has become a very deep friend of mine. We speak regularly. A bit gutting he can't be here tonight. His eyesight isn't good and he finds it hard to travel these days. But he is so crystal clear that colluding with people is not loving them. And he's always really encouraged me. Even though I'm middle class, right? I've not from a background where I can claim to be affected by these same issues. Now that can make me nervous, make me think, who am I to talk like this? But working with people like Chris, he's saying, well, it's true. So you've got to carry on saying it. And I must say that in my experiences ever since have reinforced this belief in grace and truth, that the truth isn't just the pragmatic bit where you're being a bit mean. It's actually the bit that can cut through. You go to any rehab, right, and you sit and talk to the people in the rehab and ask them what the trigger for their recovery journey is. So often it's consequences and difficult things. They don't say, oh, it was when someone was really nice to me that I decided to change. It's actually some tough consequences often. So, I believe that, but I think how we can build that, how we can practice that, how can we have conferences that talk about that rather than just a load of nodding heads saying, yes, injustice is terrible. We need to get better at this stuff.
Hey, John, are you ready?
I'm nervous, but ready.
So my name's Sally Mann. I'm from Red Letter Christians UK and Bonnie Downs Church, and an EastEnder finding herself in Mayfair tonight asking the question the room might not want. Yeah, truth to those whose poverty might be trapping them into a dependency culture. What about truth to the wealthy? Would you join with me in calling for a wealth tax, particularly perhaps on those who've already got property? What about capital gains tax being equalised? What about a wealth tax? Oh, wonderful. Oh, I'm surprised.
Good.
Looking at this room, I thought I might sink like a stone. But what about equalising the taxes on wealth with the taxes on work? And I'm speaking about this as a working class woman.
Yes. Yep, clap. For the 4 years I was working for the government, it was tricky having questions a bit like that. I'm no expert in the kind of tax issues you're talking about, but absolutely, I agree, Sally. I mean, I think this is why I made that number one point about the connection with justice. I think that how we can feed the frontline experiences more into policy asks. Obviously, an organisation, Heather's here from the Trussell Trust, they've been, at the forefront, really, of using frontline experience translated into policy asks. And I think that is absolutely what we need. And so integrating the worlds of politics and social action is so vital. I hope the Labour government is really radical. The West End of London, it is interesting that we're meeting in Mayfair. I used to walk up every day from Victoria up to the West London Mission. And of course, we've got a problem of poverty. We've also got a problem of wealth. Jesus speaks more about that than just about any other issue, doesn't he? One of the things I really love about Hope into Action is that we don't just have a ministry to people affected by poverty, but a ministry to people who've got riches, because it's mainly wealthy people who are choosing to invest money in our houses. We were started by founder Ed Walker, who put 30,000 of his own money into our first house. We've now attracted over £28 million worth of investment into housing. Now, that's still a drop in the ocean, but it's an example that this is a two-way street. And we need to speak truth to power, and we need to speak truth to everyone. I agree, and I hope the new government is radical.
Thanks, John.
Hello.
Raymond Friel, I'm from Caritas Social Action Network, which is the
agency of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. John, I really enjoyed your talk. I think I'm with you probably more than 85%. That's good. It was really stimulating. My question is around something you touched on, and I wouldn't mind you sort of coming back to it a little bit more. And it's a question about Christian organisations and agencies working with other groups that aren't Christian, so the NGOs. I think the Catholic tradition in recent years, we talk about people of goodwill. So they might not be Christian at all, but we have common cause with them. And it's very much on our mind at Caritas Social Action Network, because we have a number of our dioceses are asking questions, how do we do justice? So we've been very, very good at compassion for a long time. And I think it's as if we're just asking ourselves, how do we do justice? It's the how, the actual tactics and strategies.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, a lot of dioceses actually get into partnership and contract in organisations like Citizens UK.
Yep.
Now, I spoke at a conference with the Cardinal, who's at Citizens UK, and I found it very interesting. Not a Catholic organisation, but a lot of commonality and a lot of tactics that would enable Catholic schools and Catholic parishes to do justice and enact justice. Now, you seem to you just hinted at it, but you seem to suggest the danger, and I think I know what you meant about being operationalised, and there's a danger there. So Can you just say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that we should be distinctive. So, I mean, you could use the metaphor Jesus uses of light, the city on a hill shining out. So that's very distinctive. But also he talks about salt, doesn't he? Being, more implicit, more working through the dough. And I think that we need to do both. We need to partner with all kinds of agencies. Homelessness agencies have to partner with all kinds of people because no one comes off the streets through the work of one agency. You've got to work together. You've got to work together with the council. You've got to work together, with all kinds of agencies that might believe different things. But that doesn't mean you can't hold on to your distinctiveness. And I think we've got to have more of a missionary zeal to go into rooms and talk about our Christian faith far more confidently. I find the homeless sector, for example, far less secular than it was 30 years ago. The talk about spirituality and love is far more on the agenda. So I'd see it like a Venn diagram, really, that we overlap in key areas. And I think Citizens UK, I mean, they've done a lot of what we're talking about. They get an issue. And I remember right at the start, the whole living wage campaign was an example of the sort of justice Sally's talking about. And it's really built on these sort of little platoons of churches and mosques and synagogues, all kinds of different beliefs, but they overlap. Now, I think that's a real model of distinctive yet engaged. The last thing I want to do is encourage people to go into a Christian ghetto.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I mean, your point about distinctiveness is so important within that justice frame, especially if churches are working with the likes of Citizens UK, because that's a very powerful organisation. So churches need to hold on to their own distinctiveness and not outsource the justice to a big organisation. I've got some great questions online as well. There's two questions here about funding, which I'd like to put together. One is from Grant. He says, do you think funders are preventing or perceived to be how truth is able to be made known? And then Sharon, who's a street pastor, says, during my 8 years as a street pastor, we were actively discouraged by funding criteria, amongst other things, of being overtly people of faith. Squaring this circle is extremely difficult in practice.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And I've worked in environments where the Christian faith has become very diluted. And for those of you who work in organizations like that, you can experience the tension. Someone described it to me once as, if you want to put back a Christian ethos, it's like putting toothpaste back into a tube. And that is a real danger, which is why I'm excited to go into to work for an organization which has got a very clear kind of basis. But I think there is so much that can be done with confidence. At the West London Mission, it was a very diverse workforce, but we introduced chaplaincy. And that was a really good way of making some explicit Jesus opportunities available alongside running complex operations. We ran a registered care home for people with chronic alcohol addiction and a approved premise for people coming out of prison. They're very complex services. And I had to go into rooms where the Ministry of Justice said to me, oh, you can't have a chaplain. If you're going to have a chaplain, you need to have a representative of every other world religion at the same time. I said, what, is it going to be like a bevy of faith leaders walking around together? And we just said, no, we're not having that, and they backed down because, so, we need to be humble, of course, and aware of the problems that people have, the hang-ups, but we've got to be confident, I think. And it's tragic, I think, if something like street pastors, ends up saying, well, yeah, that's just a name we used to use. We can't really talk about God anymore.
The funding issue is really critical, isn't it?
It is.
They do drive the agenda.
They do, and Grant is good. I mean, I love funders, and I really think they're fantastic. But it's really important that they set criteria in a good way, and I think make space, more confidence. I showed a provocative picture of a baptism there, because this is fruit of fantastic work. It's empowering. It's not coercive, and we need to be far more confident in that.
Okay, a couple more quick questions from Ian. Would Jon tell us more explicitly how mentoring is part of the Christian social action that you advocate?
Does he work for the Mentoring Alliance or something? I think mentoring is really important. I mean, I think the difference, if people can have one-to-one relationships, meaningful one-to-one relationships with people, where obviously as a mentor, you are not just affirming, you're challenging, probing, your permission to do that. That can have a huge impact. I mean, I know in the youth field, I'm a volunteer youth worker, mentoring is absolutely vital, and I can see the impact of it. And I think, again, with homelessness, what's really growing is befriending and connecting, one-to-one support.
Sharing a bit of your own vulnerability?
Absolutely. Well. Yeah, what you can learn. The mutuality is so vital. I just think people are really transformed not by what they receive.
It's all about relationships.
It's about what they give, It's
about enabling people to give.
Yeah.
From Richard, we have a question saying, to what extent does family instability and breakups underlie poverty, and how can grace and truth be applied to this underlying issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously a really sensitive issue, but it's one we've got to talk about. Frank talked very bluntly about the impact. I mean, one of the worst things, I think, about sort of neoliberal economic agenda is the way it's destroyed family. And I mean, in my community, I moved to Streatham in South London because it was relatively good value. But people just can't afford housing in an area like that. And even if they're both working. So the pressures on family and the willingness to talk about it, I think.
And it's not just economic, is it? I mean, the culture has become very individualistic.
Absolutely. I remember writing an article, talking about this a few years ago because, when I worked at Centrepoint in Soho, the number one issue for the young people walking through our door was family breakdown. Mm. But whenever Centrepoint did a report, they never mentioned family breakdown. And when I studied social work, it was all economics, but nothing mentioned about family breakdown because of fear of being judgmental. And that's just an unwillingness to talk about what's true.
It's become politicized, the family.
Yeah, and because it's sensitive, but it's so important. We talk about families are so vital to all of us. And I've certainly found with some of my family here tonight, I know grace and truth is very relevant, on that front.
Question from Anna saying, thank you so much. This has made me fizz with excitement. Can I ask, what have you found most impactful in persuading Christians that we have a legitimate biblical and theological mandate to engage in system change? Quick answer.
The Book of Amos. The prophets were so political and agitative, and that's what we need to get back that. That the idea that prophetic is all personal and spiritualized is just not biblical.
Last question from Terry Drummond. Looking back to the faith in the city should not be about nostalgia. It can be an opportunity to ask, how do we pick up the themes and challenges in the contemporary church? What do you make of that?
I think it can be, but I would spend 5 minutes talking about faith in the city before getting on to talk about what's really important now. I think there is a bit of sort of looking back and thinking, oh, that was a great time because the Thatcher government hated this report. I think it's better to think more self-critically and, to move on to what we need to do now.
Yeah, I think part of it is that understanding that our political economy has changed. And so we need new responses.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jon. This has been amazing. I'm going to wrap up now, but can I ask you to... So I think the volume of questions, and there were more, just shows you how much energy there is around this and how much this conversation is needed. So thank you, Jon, again. We're in your debt. And I want to thank the way you've done this. You've set a profound provocation for us. You set the scene for the honest conversation I was hoping for, and I hope people take that up. I really do. I thank you for graciously accepting my challenge. And it's been a lot of work, and I've really enjoyed working with you. You've engaged us in the life of Christ, in the thinking of Bonhoeffer, Newbigin, Catholic social thought. It's been brave of you to do all of that. And you've grounded everything in your own experience, in your practice. So I think you have really helped us strike that balance between theology and practice. So thank you again. And thank you to all of you here and to everyone watching at home. I hope this will have prompted you to think, and I hope to start a conversation, whether you're a volunteer or a church leader or a charity leader or an activist or a charity worker or a funder or a member of a congregation. My guess is that many of you will feel challenged. Some will strongly disagree. But I hope that everyone will sense that there is a prophetic challenge around this. And so I hope that you'll feel drawn to look more deeply at these questions. So the recording and the text of Jon's talk will be online soon. We'll be releasing it as a podcast too in due course. And in the next edition of our newsletter, which should be out in a few days, if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, go to togetherforthecommongood.co.uk. Together for the Common Good is a small charity doing a lot, as well as events like this. We have a podcast, so please try that out, Leaving Egypt, which I co-host with my friend Alan Roxburgh in Vancouver. Check out our Common Good Schools programme for 11 to 16-year-olds. Have a look at our website for all our resources. And if you can, please support us with a donation to support the work. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone behind the scenes, quite a lot of people that have helped me get tonight up and running. And thank you especially again to CCLA for sponsoring. So thank you again to everyone, and thank you, Jon, and good night and God bless. That was a provocative and energising talk from Jon Kuhrt. He set the scene for the honest conversation that I think is needed. I'm grateful to him for so graciously accepting my challenge, engaging us in the life of Christ. He's drawn on Bonhoeffer, Newbigin, and on Catholic social thought, and he grounded everything in stories of real people from his own experience. I hope that in listening to this, whether you're a volunteer, a church or charity leader, an activist or charity worker, a funder, or a member of a congregation, you might feel prompted to start a conversation. My guess is you may feel challenged, and you may strongly disagree with some of what he said. But I hope you sense that there is a prophetic challenge around this, and that you might feel drawn to look more deeply into the questions Jon has posed about impact, power, and authentic Christian witness.